The inspector was waiting by my desk when I finally got back to the station. He had a stack of papers in his hand that he kept flipping through. "What's all that?" I asked. He glanced up, startled, as if he hadn't heard me come in. "I've been looking through my research, and I found a disturbing link between the victims," he said. He handed me the papers and stabbed at the first source so hard his finger almost poked through it. "Look at this article. Edgar Guerrero was involved in a car accident 8 years ago that nearly killed him. It was a 4-car pileup. The paper says he would have gone through the windshield on impact if he hadn't been wearing his seatbelt. And look at this." He shifted the papers and showed me a grayscale printout. It's a blog post from Vivian Tracy. Apparently she was skydiving with her college roommate last summer when she had a close call with her ripcord. Her parachute almost didn't open. A few more seconds and she would have hit the ground full force. I glanced through the inspector's sources. The newspaper didn't say much about Edgar's car crash, but the vehicles in the picture had been crumpled like used soda cans, and I had a hard time imagining anyone walking away from this one. The post from Vivian's blog was cheery and riddled with emoticons. There was a photograph of her plummeting through the air, laughing, with a stretch of grassy ground waiting far below to meet her. The girl in this picture had no idea how close she would come to dying. I thought of her body, splattered in a puddle on the front porch, and an unpleasant tingle crawled over my skin. "This can't be coincidental," I agreed, handing back the files. "But what do these sources have to do with Ellery Pickett?" The inspector reached for the desk and withdrew another sheet of printer paper. "This is a license renewal issued to Mr. Pickett just last year." He passed it to me, his fingers taut. The license was newly issued, just as the inspector had said, but the figure in the photo was far too young to be Ellery. That's not to say that there wasn't a resemblance. His nose had that same crooked bent to it, and his stringy black hair was already starting to thin. I could imagine it growing white and wispy in several years' time. "This guy's only 40 years old," I said, looking up from the paper. "The old man I saw on Ellery's porch must have been his father or something. There's no way a person could age that much in the course of 1 year." The inspector snapped his fingers. "But that's just it. Ellery has aged. Several decades in a matter of months. I knew what we were dealing with the second you described him to me. There's something inside him. Something that's been eating away at his years until he became that dried-up husk you saw." I furrowed my brow. "You want to run that by me again?" The inspector began to pace in agitated circles. "You don't have a word for what this thing is. Let's just call it a time eater. It's messing around in the past, turning these people's near-death experiences into real death experiences." Whoa, slow down," I said. "What are you saying?" The inspector stopped his pacing. "This entity doesn't perceive time the same way you do. It's not a linear progression. It's like a piece of lattice work, a series of avenues that go forward and backward and sideways in all directions." He tried to gesture with his hands, but gave up. "This thing is reaching back in time and tweaking little details. An unbuckled seatbelt, a faulty parachute or pull cord, so that our victims die years before they should have. The past tries to catch up to the present and wham! Instant death. The Time Eater takes those missing years and feeds on them. That's how it stays alive. It's like a parasite, leeching the life force out of others." "Okay, hold up," I said. "I don't quite understand what you're talking about. But do you hear how crazy you sound? I agree that whatever's happening here is weird, but you can't just go around inventing monsters that fill in all the blanks. There's a perfectly rational answer to all of this, and we'll find it. Just give us time. We don't have time. Didn't you hear me? This thing feeds on time. Every second we waste is another second it could be stalking its next prey. He rubbed his cheek hastily, clouds of dense smoke billowing from his mouth. I know you don't believe me yet, but this is your answer, Mark. So grab your car and let's go. We need to stop Ellery before he feeds again. He slammed the papers onto my desk and strode to the door, his trench coat whipping behind him. I glanced down at the wrinkled stack of files. Ellery's impassive face stared back up at me. I wasn't ready to buy into the inspector's time-eater theory just yet. But what was it that Sherlock Holmes said once? When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Ellery Pickett may not have been a time-eating monster from outer space, but he was a common link in both of our mysterious death cases, and he may have played some sort of role in the murders. It was worth a look at the least. I must be insane, I mumbled to myself, but I followed the inspector out of the station, making sure to turn the lights off behind me. Marconi wasn't too happy to leave her patrol at this hour of the night, but I told her that we had a lead on the mysterious deaths, however tenuous, and the inspector had requested backup, just in case. I trusted Marconi. She was a hell of a shot and she excelled under pressure. I'd witnessed her handle bomb threats and lines of incessant gunfire without breaking a sweat. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say she'd saved my life a few times over. There was no one I wanted more on the force to watch our backs. She met us in the heart of the Skokomish Bluffs, her headlights off and her engine reduced to a low thrum. It wasn't an unusual sound to hear this far into the wilderness. It could have easily been the purr of a mountain cat. Ellery's house waited for us at the top of the bluffs, tiny as an architect's model from where we were standing. The dim moonlight glimmered off his greenhouse. Marconi glanced up at it, then back at us. "You boys want to tell me what you're doing in the ass crack of nowhere?" she asked. "Just stay here and keep an eye on the place," the inspector said. "If you hear any sort of commotion, grab your gun and follow us immediately. Don't hesitate to shoot if necessary." "Sorry to drag you into this," I said, putting one hand on the hood of her cruiser. "It should just be a simple Q&A, but the inspector's getting kind of paranoid, given how extreme these cases have gotten." The bluffs were quiet for a few moments, an owl hooted in some distant tree. "I seriously appreciate you coming out here, "All right, but you owe me," she replied. The smile that flickered on her face was almost a smirk, but it settled into something softer. I gave her a weak salute and turned to join the inspector. We kept to the shadows as we ascended the hill towards Ellery's house. "Keep your gun ready," the inspector said under his breath. I hesitated. This was supposed to be a peaceful investigation, but he sounded so earnest that I slipped my pistol out of its holster. I gripped it with both hands, the metal cold under my fingers. It felt heavier than usual. Maybe there was something in the air out here. The building couldn't have been more than one story, but it loomed over us as we approached. We climbed onto the front porch with hesitant footsteps. A gust of wind picked up, causing the porch swing to drift lazily back and forth. I reached out to ring the doorbell, but the inspector stopped my hand. The front door was open just a crack, revealing a dark foyer with a welcome mat and a dried potted plant. He gestured for us to go inside. We don't have a warrant, I hissed. Are you crazy? Trust me, a warrant is the least of our worries, he replied. He ducked his head and slipped across the threshold. Swearing under my breath, I held up my gun and followed him into the dark entrance hall. I nearly stumbled over another flower pot in the process. They were strewn everywhere along the rug, roots upended, dirt spilling out in clumps. The inspector reached down and picked up one of the fallen leaves. It was gray and crispy, and it crumbled into dust at his touch. The time eater's been feeding, he said quietly. It must have sucked all the juice out of Ellery's plants before moving on to humans, but even that's not enough. Its vessel is aging faster than it can feed. If you're done speaking gibberish, can we get a move on here? I whispered. Jesus, this was illegal in so many ways. Ellery could sue the shit out of us for entering his house without a warrant. I wasn't exactly sure what the inspector was trying to accomplish here. A ceramic clatter issued from the back of the house, and the inspector froze. The greenhouse, he said. He rose from his crouched position and darted through the doorway, his slender body disappearing in the darkness of the next room. I gritted my teeth and raced after him. The kitchen was already empty when I stepped inside. Where the hell had he run off to? Another clatter came from deeper in the house, louder this time. It sounded like someone had thrown a flower pot into the ground. I dodged past the kitchen table, overflowing with empty plates and silverware, before ducking into a side hallway and heading toward the greenhouse. The door had already been thrown open for me, so I hurried inside. Everything had an eerie silver tint in the moonlight. Plots of earth stood on raised platforms, dried ferns and withered flowers slumping in piles on the soil. Flower pots were perched on every spare inch of shelf space. I spun in a slow circle, keeping my gun held up, eyes peeled for any sign of movement. I couldn't tell where the crash had come from. There was no ceramic littering the ground, no splatter of roots and dirt. My shoes made light tapping noises on the linoleum as I made my cautious way to the back of the greenhouse. Then, a hunched shape came lunging at me from behind one of the raised platforms, fingers curled like claws. Ellery? His head was thrown back, and his wispy hair fluttered behind him as he ran. A guttural cry rose in his throat and pierced my ears. Without thinking, I raised my gun and fired off a single shot. Ellery veered out of the way with almost inhuman agility, moving far faster than any man his age should be able to. Then he crashed into me, knocking me against a glass cabinet and latching onto my arm with one clawed fist. I cried out. My gun flew from my hand and skittered away across the greenhouse floor. Veins popped under his grip, glowing in lines of neon red beneath my skin. The same red glow pulsed from his open mouth. At first, I thought his teeth were missing, but no, it was more than that. The space between his jaws had been completely hollowed out. No gums, no tongue, no esophagus, just a gaping maw where his mouth should be. I kicked at his shins and tried to struggle free, but his grip was stronger than I would have expected from an old man, if he even was an old man anymore. His eyes had taken on an odd silver sheen, like he was wearing mirrored contact lenses. A tangled sort of snarl escaped from the void that was his throat. His grip tightened, and suddenly, my brain was flooded with images. At first, they were just flashes. Memories that zipped past me with a crackle and a burst of static, but eventually they took on a stuttering sense of cohesion, like a film reel spinning. I recognized this night. It must have been 3 years ago, when I was still new to the force. I saw myself crouched behind my police cruiser, gun clenched in one sweaty hand, listening as bullets whistled past the car and shattered somebody's windshield. Red and blue lights spun in circles around me. When the firing stopped, I lunged up and aimed my gun at the shooter, shouting orders to surrender. The bullet caught me in the chest before I could even finish speaking. It knocked the wind out of me and sent me sprawling on my back. If it hadn't been for the Kevlar vest I was wearing, I would have died that night. The bullet had stopped just inches from my heart. Except, this memory was different. As Ellery squeezed my arm, the Kevlar began to disintegrate beneath my uniform, shriveling away as if it had never been there in the first place. Maybe it hadn't. This was my missing seatbelt, my faulty ripcord. Ellery was racing the safety blanket from my past. As the Kevlar shrank away, I could feel the bullet resuming its suspended course, burrowing through my shirt and sinking its cold metal body into the flesh above my heart. Then the inspector burst out of nowhere, barreled into the old man, and sent him crashing to the floor of the greenhouse. His fingers detached from my skin with a strange, wet sucking sound. The memory of my night in the crossfire jerked backward, like the sensation of an elastic snapping, and I collapsed against the glass cabinet. It came crashing down on the pots of dead flowers. I drew in a shuddering gasp of air and tried to regain my balance. The memory of the bullet still burned against my chest, but my shirt was dry, and I didn't think it had pierced the skin. I could have been a bit woozy from Ellery messing with my mind. As I staggered to my feet, I thought I saw the old man pick up the inspector and hurl him through the back wall of the greenhouse. His body smashed through with enough force to make the glass explode outward in a shower of tiny shards. Ellery leaped through the gaping hole and threw himself on top of the inspector. I got down on my knees and began scrambling through the mess of soil and broken glass, searching for my fallen gun. My vision was swimmy, and I had to stop a few times to keep myself from keeling over out of dizziness. But I kept moving. I'd seen what Ellery, or the thing inside Ellery, was capable of. I had to stop him before he got his hands on the inspector, too. At last, my fingers closed around a familiar metal handle, and I got shakily to my feet, gun in hand. I stumbled through the jagged hole and back into the fray. The stretch of grass behind the greenhouse couldn't have been longer than 20 or 30 feet. Beyond that was a dizzying drop into the wilderness. The inspector grappled with Ellery, a cigar still clenched between his teeth. The smoke that billowed from his lips had turned a dusty shade of red. As they fought, they staggered farther and farther backwards in an effort to drive the other one over the edge. Ellery scrabbled at the inspector's arms, trying to sink his claws in and start the whole time-eating process all over again. But as strong as he was, the inspector was stronger. He moved too fast for my delirious eyes to follow, his trench coat whipping behind him like the wings of some avenging angel. I aimed my pistol at the pair of struggling figures, but I couldn't get a lock on Ellery in my current condition, and I was too afraid I would take out the inspector by mistake. Blood pumped in my ears. I'd been in plenty of scrapes during my time on the force, but never had I felt so helpless. The inspector managed to thrust Ellery away from him for a few seconds, so that the old man stumbled back to the lip of the cliff, his arms swinging in a pinwheel. I pointed my gun at him, trying to squeeze out a bullet before the creature could get its balance again, but it was too late. His jaw was unhinging, and he was lunging at the inspector, eyes gleaming, claws extended. Ellery staggered backward, two fleshy red holes appearing in his chest. Silver goo dripped from the wounds and into the knee-high grass. I turned to see Marconi advancing on the old man, her gun drawn. Ellery bellowed at her, the throaty, tortured yell of an angry animal. She fired again and again, each shot driving him back just a little further, until finally he stepped backwards and slipped off the edge of the cliff. His scream was shrill enough to make my eardrums bleed. It lowered in volume as he plummeted towards the forest floor and cut off suddenly in a choked cry of agony. The ground gave the slightest of trembles. Then a breathy sigh escaped into the night, as if the earth itself had let out one loud, miserable gasp of breath. I got unsteadily to my feet and limped across the yard towards Marconi. I'd seen her take down guys twice her size without flinching, but when she lowered her gun, her hands were visibly shaking. "What the hell was that, Hannigan?" she shouted. "The investigation was a bust," the inspector replied. I jumped. I'd been so focused on reaching Marconi that I hadn't heard him approach. Mr. Pickett resisted our questioning and became violent, and was unfortunately killed when he tried to assault Detective Hannigan. It's unlikely he had anything to do with the recent deaths. We should return to the station and go back to the drawing board on this one. Marconi frowned at him. I knew she wouldn't buy it. Marconi was a massive skeptic, but she also believed her own eyes. And she'd seen the thing Ellery had become. There was no way she could have missed the guttural scream. It still hung in the air, like the static that pricks up the hair on the back of your arms right before a thunderstorm. "Okay, fine," she said at last. She glanced between the two of us, her eyes narrowed. "I'll play along for now, but someday, Hannigan, you're going to tell me exactly what the fuck happened tonight." I lifted a hand to my ear and felt a damp spot just below the earlobe. I drew back my bloody hand and stared at it for a few moments in the moonlight. Then I looked up at the inspector. The face hidden behind his fog of cigar smoke was dark and unreadable. "I'd like to know that too," I said. The next evening, I was driving through a dense patch of forest on my way to patrol in the lower glade. It had rained that night. Clouds of mist billowed up from the road and swept over my cruiser, looking for all the world like a wave of swampy spirits. I turned on my high beams and gave the windshield a wipe to clear away the drizzle. A particularly dense cloud washed over my car, and when it cleared, the inspector was waiting for me on the edge of the forest. I almost drove right past him. Slamming my foot on the brakes, I yanked the wheel to the right, tires splashing through puddles that lined the uneven stretch of street. I climbed out of the cruiser and stood across from him, light raindrops still pattering on the roof of my car. Neither of us spoke for some time. His fedora was low enough to hide his eyes, and the tip of his cigar still smoldered, even in the damp weather. "Are you going to actually tell me what happened last night?" I asked. The inspector blew out a single smoke ring. "I need to show you something," he replied. And then the inspector wavered. I'm not sure how else to describe it. Nothing about his outward appearance changed, but it looked as if his body had been hollowed out, like a doll or a puppet, and there was something much larger encompassing it, something unseen pulling the strings. The illusion, whatever it was, lasted no more than a few seconds. He was just the inspector again. Tendrils of steam escaped from his cigar and mingled with the misty air. "You're not human," I said. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, but they also felt right. "You're like that thing we fought up in Skokomish Bluffs." "I am not a parasite," he replied. He didn't sound offended, just a bit sad. I could have tried to argue with him, with the rational side of me that knew he must be lying, but Sherlock Holmes was right. I'd glimpsed the improbable that night on the bluffs, and it may have thrown askew everything I thought I knew about the world, but it was the truth. There was no point trying to deny what my own eyes had seen. Did that scare me? Of course it did. The foundations of my reality had grown shaky, and part of me was still clamoring for that one sane foothold. But sometimes, rationality can only take you so far. "Why do all this?" I asked him. "We must be, I don't know, like animals to you, or talkative bacteria. Why bother going through all this effort to help us?" The inspector looked away from me, his hidden eyes staring off into the mist. The tip of Mount Palmer floated in the midst of it all, crags piercing the clouds. It could have been some eldritch beast loping through the fog. Reality, all the stuff you see around you and all the stuff you don't, it's huge. There are beings out there with shapes and sizes you couldn't even begin to fathom, and those with any sort of sentience look down on you people like protozoa. You're specks in a petri dish, bits of dim light that aren't worth the effort to snuff. He looked down at his hand and flexed his slender fingers, as if he was still unused to his borrowed shape. "But not to me," he said. "I look at humans and see honor, love, loyalty so strong you would take a bullet for the ones you trust. Archaic values to some of my kind, but I think they're worth protecting. Maybe that's naive of me, but I don't think so." He took the cigar from his mouth and tapped it against the side of his trench coat. Flecks of ash trickled from the tip and vanished into the soggy ground. "So in some ways, you're right," he said. "You're small, but you're not insignificant. Don't ever forget that." The sound of his voice gave way to crickets and the ever-present rustling of trees. I stared up again at Mount Palmer, thinking of the odd weather patterns, the missing chickens, the noises in the woods, the countless unsolved cases we had buried back at the station. "It's the Neverglades, isn't it?" I said. "There's something about this place, something that brings all the strangeness to the surface." He pondered the question for a moment. "In most parts of the world, beings like me keep to ourselves. We stay behind the veil and don't bother getting involved with humans. But the veil is thin here. There's a rip in reality, if you will, and sometimes things like Ellery slip through. Mindless, hungry things." "And if more of them get through?" I asked, turning to him. "How do I know you've got my back?" The inspector smiled. He may not have been one of us, but that one gesture seemed so genuine, so human, that I half wondered if we were rubbing off on him. "I told you before, I go where I'm needed," he said. "When the time comes, you'll know exactly where to find me." He tipped his hat to me, drops of rain rolling down the brim. Then he took a step backward into the forest. The trees shifted around him, their branches sweeping in like leafy arms to enfold his silhouette. I watched as his body shrank away and became one with the darkness. Soon, there was nothing left of the inspector but the glowing tip of his cigar. It pulsed like a tiny firefly bobbing its way through the trees. Then the mist settled in around me, cold and heavy, and I found myself alone on that barren stretch of highway.